I've always had this strange fascination with trying to take PCs and making them do things that they were never really designed to do. Along those same lines, today we're going to try to take this bog standard office PC in a Dell Optiplex 3040 and turn it into a gaming PC. And I'm sure everything will go swimmingly. Server room, this is the captain. Rhett, is there something going on down there I need to know about?
We're on UPS backup, sir. The main Teardown couplers have come unaligned. The tachyon router is tangled with the secondary gazonta
In
router.
English, Mr. Rhett?
It's the bandwidth, sir. Getting it down's not the problem, it's getting it back up.
Well, do what you can, but remember, I've got a budget here.
I'm gonna have to call you back.
Hosting your own servers also means you get to host all your own problems. Even the most skilled chief engineers will tell you you should decentralize your network. So why not host your services with Linode? If it runs on Linux, it'll run on Linode. They offer shared CPU plans for as little as $5 per month and can scale as high as you need to go, with dedicated CPUs, S3 compatible object storage, GPU hosting, NVMe block storage, and more. Linode is also expanding at light speed, with 12 new global data centers planned before the end of 2023. Visit linode.com/craftcomputing and get a $100 60-day credit just for signing up for a new account. That's linode.com/craftcomputing, and again, thanks to Linode for sponsoring today's video. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. So, electronics recyclers are some of my favorite places in the world because you can find machines like this and let your imagination run wild. In front of us on the table today is a Dell Optiplex 3040, and it is a fairly bog standard office PC. Inside, we've got a Core i5 6500, quad core, so 4 cores, 4 threads, 8 gigabytes of DDR3L 1600 megahertz memory. We've got an Intel HD Graphics 530, and check this out, it's actually still got an optical drive in it. Now, the Dell Optiplex is available in many different shapes and sizes. This is kind of their mid-tower, and it's also the least desirable of all the form factors. They start off as these really cute 1-inch tall small form factor PCs. There's one that's kind of a desktop unit that takes half-height PCI Express cards. This one will take a full-height PCI Express card, but only the full-height PCI Express card. You can't have anything any larger than the PCI bracket itself. Then there's the full-size desktop, which takes basically any size graphics card that you could ever want, and also has a much beefier power supply. I say this is the least desirable out of all the Optiplexes because you have that height restriction on your PCI Express graphics card, and most modern cards are larger than the PCI bracket itself. Also inside of here is only a 240 watt power supply with no dedicated 12 volt PCI Express power, so you can't even supply ancillary power, making it pretty much impossible to put a modern graphics card in here. I say pretty much because where there's a will, there's a way. This has plenty of SATA power inside of it, and while I wouldn't rely on it for supplying, 300 watts worth of graphics card power, because, again, there's only a 240 watt power supply in here, running up to 125, 150 watt card should be possible with an adapter like this. This is a dual SATA to 8-pin PCI Express power adapter, and it's exactly what we're going to use today. Now, one of the most popular graphics cards to put into low-buck builds like this over the last number of years has been the RX 580 or the AliExpress variant of the RX 580, the RX 580 2048 SP. I wouldn't go that route with this particular build, again, because of that 240 watt power supply. The RX 580 at the low end takes about 180 watts, and at the high end can actually draw in excess of about 250. It's not a ideal matching for a 240 watt power supply. Instead, we are going to go with another AliExpress card. This is the GTX 1660 Super 6GB. So we are giving up a couple of gigabytes of our video memory, but this is only a 120 watt TDP card. So even when coupled with a 65 or even 80 watt TDP CPU, there should be more than enough power available to make all of this work. Now the motherboard inside of here does support Intel Skylake or Kaby Lake, that is 6th or 7th generation Intel Core CPUs. And I figured I could just jump onto eBay and pick one up for about 20 bucks and get a 4-core 8-threaded unit. Ha! Said the secondary market. The i7-6700 non-K model is still going for like 70 or 80 bucks, which is more than I paid for the entire PC. But, again, where there's a will, there's a way. This is the Intel Xeon E3 1275V5, and it is the Skylake Xeon variant available in the same consumer socket. It is 4 cores and 8 threads, has the same 3.8 gigahertz turbo clock, but this one was just 29 bucks. Not a bad deal if I do say so myself. Now, while my $50 bill at the electronics recycler did pick me up the Optiplex 3040, which has the i5-6500, it's got a motherboard, a power supply, and a case, it also came with 8 gigabytes of memory, but unfortunately only in a single stick. And Skylake in particular really needs dual channel to get all of your CPU performance out of it. With that in mind, I did pick up a 16 gigabyte kit of DDR3L 1600 memory on Amazon for about $17. Now, in theory, you only have to spend about $10 or $11 to get a single stick of this, and one stick added in here would give me dual channel. I went ahead and spent $17 on the pair. It's a better value to get 2 sticks. Also, I figured I could always use a match set on hand rather than a mismatch set that I would have ended up with. So if you want to save $5, just buy a single stick. Now, unfortunately, this PC did not come with any storage at all, and even if it did, it would have been mechanical hard drives, which, honestly, let's just get rid of them at this point in consumer PCs. So I grabbed the Silicon Power A55 1TB SATA SSD. Now, this is going for about $58 on Amazon today, and honestly, that is way too expensive for this drive. I picked this up for just $43 a couple of months ago, and it's actually bottomed out as recently as maybe 4 weeks ago for $35. $35 for a 1TB is definitely where I would be buying today. I wouldn't spend probably more than $45 for the same 1TB. So in total, with everything, we're looking at $286 that I spent on this build. However, you can get a lot of these things quite a bit cheaper if you do some shopping around or even buy more used gear, especially on the graphics card side of things. This graphics card is going for about $140 on AliExpress today. I honestly wouldn't pay more than $100 for a GTX 1660 Super on a used site. So definitely an opportunity to get this build potentially all the way down as low as like $200 if you really scrimp every last penny. But $285, I'm more than curious to see what level of performance we're able to get out of this build. But there's nothing left to do but put this thing together and see how it does. While we're at it, I'll also show you kind of why this is the least desirable chassis out of all the Optiplex 3040s. So let's go ahead and get started. So first off, let's just go ahead and get this thing apart. It's a fairly lightweight desktop. We've got 2 screws, one on the top and one on the bottom, and then the whole side panel pops right off. So just like that. After that, you can see it's fairly compact quarters inside of here. The next thing we do is actually take the faceplate off. So there's these 3 little tabs right there. That lifts right off. And then the case opens like a clamshell. And there we go. And that's all the room you get to work with. So inside of here, we've got our proprietary 240 watt power supply. So you're not going to be upgrading that with an ATX unit anytime soon. So don't even think about it. In the bottom left of the chassis, we've got 2 2.5-inch drive mounts. Unfortunately, they do require sleds, and this chassis did not include any sleds. But there are 2 SATA power plugs down here, which we will be utilizing to power our graphics card. Up a little further on this side panel, there is a laptop-style tray mount optical drive here, and there's another 2 SATA power cables up here, and 2 SATA data cables as well. And that's actually where we're going to plug in our 2.5-inch SSD, and we're just going to let it dangle up here in the unused space. Beyond that, there are 2 DIMM slots, and these are DDR3L. Now, the weird thing about Skylake is it actually supports DDR3, DDR3L, or DDR4. However, this motherboard appears to only support DDR3L. And inside of here, we have an 8 gigabyte stick of 12800U or 1600 MTS memory. Now, one thing I could have done is just leave the i5 6500 and saved a couple of bucks, but I did want that 4 cores and 8 threads as games are increasingly becoming more and more multi-threaded, and I didn't want to leave any performance on the table. It's not that the 6500 is a bad CPU, it's just not the best CPU you can get for this platform. And honestly, a $30 upgrade, not that terrible. Beyond that, there's not much else in here. There's a very basic CPU cooler on here. It's a Dell OEM cooler and a single 80mm exhaust fan. So if you are planning on kitting one of these out, you're not going to be putting very powerful components into here, which is great because there's not a lot of cooling inside of here either. But for the parts that we're putting in, a 1660 120 watt GPU and an 80 watt TDP CPU, this should be more than adequate. I didn't notice this before, but my case is actually very badly bent. It looked like it was kicked in around the power supply area. The whole bracket is pushed in a little bit, and the power supply is actually sitting a little crooked inside of there because of that. But I think that just adds to the whole sleeper aesthetic, don't you? All right, I think that's enough looking around inside of there. Let's go ahead and start getting these upgrades in place. And I think we'll start with the CPU. Now, I did test the system with the 6500. I have not tested it with the Xeon yet. So if this doesn't work, we might be dead in the water and having to use the 6500. So I think we'll swap that out first and see if this thing even turns on with it. So let's go ahead and get this cooler off of here.
Dad,
Yes?
Lucy's dad got some food for you.
Lucy's dad has some food for me?
No, Lucy's dad got something for you.
Oh, got something for me? Oh, okay. So let's go ahead and get that CPU out of there. Well, I gotta love the thermal paste application, or almost complete lack thereof. And in goes our Xeon 1275 V5. There we go. So you've got to see just how dry this thermal paste really is. Go ahead and get our RAM installed here really quick. Then we'll try to boot this thing up and make sure our Xeon's actually going to work in this board. And down the rabbit hole we go. So this is the i5 6500. It is a socket LGA 1151 consumer chip made by Intel. Intel, for the longest time, used their consumer sockets with also Xeon compatible chips. And so you would have a lineup of, they were known as E3 1200 series, and then they aligned with the same V numbers as their higher end counterparts. So your 2600 V2 would be Sandy Bridge, your E3 1200 V2 would also be Sandy Bridge, but for the consumer socket. Now, for the longest time, you didn't need anything other than a matching socket to run a compatible Xeon chip until Skylake. And before anyone calls me an idiot for not knowing this, this is how we learn sometimes, is I was basing it off all the prior knowledge of all the prior generations and all the hackery that I've done in my life to get to this point. And in this case, I simply lost. This is how we learn. So the Xeon will not boot in the Optiplex 3040. So we're going to have to rock the i5 6500. Not the end of the world. This is still like I said, a halfway decent chip. I was simply trying to hedge my bets and get a little bit of extra performance out of it. But let's see what 4 cores and 4 threads does in 2023. On to the rest of the video. So now that our i5 has a fresh layer of thermal paste on it, and we've got our 16 gigs of RAM in, let's go ahead and get our video card installed. Now, for this process is entirely toolless. There's this little arm that lifts up on the side of the case, and then we can simply slide our graphics card right down in. And there we go. Now, the 1660 Super requires an 8-pin PCI Express graphics plug, which normally can provide up to 150 watts to the graphics card. However, again, this is only a 120 watt TDP card, so I don't expect us to be drawing very much off of this plug at all. I did go ahead and go with the dual SATA version of this plug, although there is a single SATA version if you'd like. But basically, we're going to take the 2 SATA plugs for the hard drives, and we're going to plug in our graphics card instead. There's 1, and there's 2. And for that, we'll just kind of tuck that away. And then when we close up this case, it'll sit in there just like that. And last but not least is our SSD, and we're just going to plug that in right next to our optical drive. We've got 2 cables conveniently sitting right there. And I'm literally just going to slide that under there and forget it exists. And with all that fully assembled, let's go ahead and put the faceplate back on here. Get the side plate back on. And that should be one completed gaming PC. Just like that. Builds like this are always so much fun because regardless of your budget or what platform you're on, you always end up learning something that you didn't know. And for instance, we learned that the Xeons, although socket compatible and from the same generation, don't work with these chipsets because, well, Skylake was the peak of Intel when it came to screwing the customer out of anything that could be more or less affordable than either their consumer or their server lineup. So, to the eWaste pile you go. But all that aside, I think the build turned out pretty spectacular, although this is definitely not an endeavor for everyone to dive into. There are some massive bottlenecks, limitations, headaches, etc. to consider if you want to build a super budget system like this. First and foremost, as I mentioned at the top of this video, the Optiplex 3040, especially this particular version of it, is not the friendliest of cases to build inside. While it may be completely toolless and very compact, you have some serious size limitations inside. You are limited to the height of the PCI bracket when it comes to your expansion slots, so no oversized cards, specifically no oversized graphics cards, and even if you do get a graphics card that will fit inside a single PCI slot, you still have to be wary of the power connectors that plug into the side of the graphics card. There's no routing those around the back in any clean way that makes sense, and it really is going to be a game of chance. Secondly, we already talked about it, but it bears reiterating power supply limitations. There's only 240 watts to work with inside of here. It's not a standard ATX power supply, so you can't swap it out for a more powerful unit, and even though you have 240 watts, there's no native PCI Express power connector inside of here. So you're going to need to keep your graphics card selection really as close to about 100 watts as you can. I'm flirting with the knife's edge at 120 watts here, given the power draw from the rest of the components we're working with. For storage, there are a couple of SATA ports on this motherboard and a couple of easy spots to install it inside the case, but SATA is all you get for storage expandability, and the further away we get from SATA being the de facto standard and the more we move into NVMe, the less that's going to be a friendly option. There are 2 additional PCI Express X1 slots on the board for additional add-in cards, so if you wanted to add in Wi-Fi or an HDMI capture card or butcher an NVMe throughput, you could totally add those into those additional slots as well. Total price of this build, once I subtracted the Xeon, which is now sitting on my desk, landed right at $249. And at that price point, when it came to gaming, pretty much nothing was off limits. But that's also not to say that the system isn't without its limitations. Let me explain. With the i5-6500 that we do have 4 cores, however, it is also only 4 threads. And as PC gaming has moved more and more into multi-threaded workloads, only having 4 threads is a major bottleneck for the system performance-wise, as basically every single game was pegging the CPU at 100% utilization. Skylake and Kaby Lake CPUs as a platform are not going to be long for this world, even in hyper-budget systems like this. Remember, 6th through 9th generation Intel consumer CPUs are beat out even by 1st generation Ryzen chips in pretty much every single situation. Plus, moving to Ryzen, you have the advantage of not only having more cores, with up to 8 CPU cores available on that platform, but you get hyper-threading on every single CPU as well. So if you even have a 4-core CPU, you get 8 threads to go along with it. That is a massive game changer in 2023. But as it sits, 4 cores and 4 threads is pretty much as high as this platform goes, as it'll still run you $70 to get an i7-6700 just for the benefit of hyperthreading. For $50 for the motherboard, case, CPU, and power supply, there's not much that's off limit when it comes to modern games. But as it turns out, even a GTX 1660 Super was too much graphics card for this particular system. Even with that CPU limitation in mind, though, we still got some pretty decent gaming performance. Baldur's Gate 3 at medium settings and 1080p managed to average 59.7 FPS, and yes, I did verify that VSync was off during testing. We got a 1% low of 26.4 and a 0.1% low of only 9.8, but I can't remember the last time I complained about a 10 FPS 0.1% low in my turn-based strategy game. Counter-Strike 2, again at 1080p and medium settings, managed 111 FPS on average, a 1% low of 56, and a 0.1% low of 39, making the esports title more than playable on this budget system. Red Dead Redemption 2 remains an incredibly demanding title in 2023, but this system handled it with relative ease, averaging 70 FPS at 1080p and the lowest balanced preset, a 1% low of 45.9, and a 0.1% low of only 35. While not the best this game has ever looked, it is still 100% playable even at desktop monitor sizes and resolutions. Jumping to another esports title in Rocket League, this time I wanted to see what the worst case scenario was for this game. So we tested at 1080p but high quality presets. We were met with 236 frames per second on average, a 1% low of 116, and a 0.1% low of just 59. Now this game isn't exactly the most difficult thing to run, but even I was impressed with that 0.1% low staying right at 60 FPS. The one game that truly struggled during my testing was Starfield, and that should be a surprise to no one. At 1080p, low settings, and no graphical enhancements like FSR or DLSS enabled, we see an average of 40.5 FPS, a 1% low of 21.3, and a 0.1% low recorded at 1.9. Now this is where that 4-core, 4-threaded, underpowered Skylake CPU starts to rear its ugly head a little bit, as I benchmarked this exact same game on the 1X Player 2 just a couple of months ago, and got nearly identical results on average and 1% lows. Now while the 1X Player has a significantly less powerful GPU in the Ryzen 780M with only 12 compute units based on RDNA 3, it also has a significant advantage in the CPU department, with the 7840U being an 8-core, 16-threaded unit. Unfortunately, since we're already at low settings, there's really nothing left to tweak here, and even lowering the resolution isn't going to improve your CPU situation. Last but not least, we have Tiny Tina's Wonderlands at 1080p and medium settings. Here we saw an average of 93 FPS, a 1% low of 35, and a 0.1% low of 11. Now, before you freak out about that 0.1% low, it is well documented in most of my testing that Tiny Tina's and a lot of the Borderlands engine games do suffer from a significant amount of lag when going from hipfire to scopefire, and that's exactly what we saw here. I would take the 1% low at 35 as what you'll actually experience in-game, meaning that this one is fully playable. Builds like this are almost more fun to me than building top-flight PCs. It seems that anyone with a budget of $1,200 or more can likely turn out a competent gaming PC just by spending money on modern parts that all fit together. But working within the constraints of both a budget and an aging platform like this, yet still getting playable results, that's a challenge I will take every single time. And I spent nearly half my life with PCs put together just like this. So It's kind of fun to reminisce and get to play with platforms that I've never had much of an opportunity to play with before. As always, if you like this video, make sure to hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on social media at Craft Computing, and if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, head on over to craftcomputing.store, pick yourself up a pint glass or any of our other designed and made in-house merch, and start drinking like a pro. That's going to do for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone. Beer for today is from Stoup Brewing up in Seattle, Washington. It is the Fresh Hop Fiend IPA, clocking in at some amount of alcohol. This one's a little interesting. I was trying to find the ABV on here, and it's not listed anywhere on the can, which is very bizarre. But it makes a little bit more sense once you read the description on the label. Welcome to Fresh Hop Series. When the annual harvest of one of our favorite ingredients makes us downright giddy, we're making a lot of fresh hop beers this season. This label will stay the same, but the beer inside will change. Make sure to check the bottom rim of the can for the hop variety, and Stoup Brewing for all of the beer stats. So somehow they got a label approved that they are fully allowed to leave the same regardless of the beer contents inside, which is something I've never heard of before. This particular one is using Eldorado hops from CLS Farms, and it was canned on 10/10/23. While that's installing, let's go ahead and talk about this Stoup Fresh Hop Fiend with Eldorado hops. I was hoping for a little bit more. I love fresh hop IPAs. They're one of my favorite styles, and this is the right time of year to get them. We're just after October, very early November. I'm shooting this on November 15th, something like that. I was hoping for a little bit more. This one is very smooth. It's got almost a cream ale type finish to it. Little bit flowery, a little bit floral. Not very citrusy. If it's citrusy, it's more bitey in flavor than lemon or orange or anything like that. So on the nose, it's a little bit floral, a little bit vegetal. Mouthfeel is very, very much like a cream ale. It's super smooth. A little bit of an aggressive carbonation right up front, and that carbonation is almost leading to it tasting more bitter than it actually is. That little aggressive CO2. It's not bad, but I was definitely hoping for a little bit better, and I think it's that just little bit of extra carbonation that's kind of putting me off to this one, where I feel there'd be a little bit richer flavor if it wasn't quite so bitter. Overall, perfectly drinkable. I wish I had a giant stack of fries to go with it, though. I think it'd be a lot better with food.